Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Vanguard, the show where we bring topics that impact our communities from a millennial perspective. This is our second show, and I'm your host, Jamell Henderson. I'm very excited for today's episode because we have an amazing panel who I'll be introducing in a moment. But I first want to thank Young Boss Media for leading the way with this amazing show. Be sure to follow them on all social media at Young Boss Media. In our last episode, which was the first episode, I was giving you the basic breakdown of how our democracy works. I shared the basic roles of our elected and appointed representatives from the federal level to our local level of government. I figured that since we are on the cusp of a major national election, that we discuss what we, as millennials, must do to make our voices heard and our issues heard from the presidential candidates. With that said, I'm excited to introduce today's panel. First, he is the Community Engagement Liaison at Neighborhoods Action, home of Save Our Streets in Brooklyn, where he works to create, maintain, and expand our strategic partnerships in Crown Heights and Bed-Stuy and with all neighborhood stakeholders, so that we can work together to reduce gun violence. He is also a proud graduate of Franklin and Marshall College, where he studied government. Please welcome Mr. Shadoe Tarver. Welcome.
Thank you.
Our next panelist, he is the Director of Neighbors in Action and a phenomenal community leader and organizer. He's also the proud graduate of my alma mater, Brooklyn College, studying political science, and he's getting ready to do some major things in the communities throughout Brooklyn. Let's welcome Mr. Brian Cunningham.
Thank you.
So please make sure you follow us on all of our social media sites and use our hashtag, The Vanguard. So, gentlemen, pleasure to have you here. I felt that this was the most appropriate time to have a panel that focuses on our issues. If we look at what's going on in the presidential elections, you're hearing major topics. Global warming, climate change is a major topic now. Criminal justice, reparations, housing, education. We have all these issues, but the question then becomes, where do we lie in it? When we look at the 2016 election, our generation was really fired up behind a particular candidate, Bernie Sanders, right? And it was a movement where it was like Bernie or bust. If we don't get our candidate in, we will not come out and vote. And literally that's what happened. Mm-hmm. And so now we're on the cusp of a major shift in our political atmosphere. And the question becomes, where do you think we stand in the midst of these issues? Are these presidential candidates really catering to us? What do you guys think?
I'm waiting for you to kick it off.
It's a very interesting question because I think a lot of the time people have forgotten about the black community, especially when it comes to electoral politics. Obviously, everyone knew how much of a part we played in the Obama elections, right? And everyone talked about the numbers and the outreach and the pouring out of support for a candidate that looked just like us. And when it came down to the 2016 election, again, there was a lot of push behind Bernie Sanders, and obviously there was a lot of discord and a lot of things happened in the primary elections. A lot of people were upset about that, right? And it really rubbed people the wrong way. So when it came time for the general election, allegedly, people didn't show up for that. I think this time around, with the number of politicians in the Democratic caucuses and the amount of politicians that are running for office this time around actually is a good thing, because it really gives people a chance to really have options, right? We still live in a two-party system. And a lot of the times people feel like, oh, this candidate isn't good enough. I'm usually going for a lesser evil, right? And I think that this time around, with having 10 or 20, different people to choose from, it actually offers people an avenue to really get behind someone that they really feel is totally within their interest. So yeah, I think that, come primary time, it is going to be up to the black vote to kind of swing a candidate a particular way. And I think that people will really see that we still are someone that you need to cater to and someone that you need to speak with on the ground.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're in the midst of a perfect storm, right, in some ways. In 2020, you have the presidential elections. You obviously have the local elections as well, the state and federal elections for members of Congress and the United States Senate. But I think you also have the census, which is also happening.
Yes.
And one thing that I'm not hearing a lot from a lot of these political candidates are the implications of the Supreme Court.
Yes.
Right? And I think when you look at 2020, it could be the moment that changes America for the next 30 years, not because of who we elect as president, but because of what that person will have the power to enact, right? In terms of if a Supreme Court justice is selected and it's another conservative on the bench, right? What does that mean for the values that we fought so hard for since the 1960s, right? The other piece is if we don't have governors doing the redistricting for the census, what does that mean for the future of the Democratic Party in particular, right? So I think there are a couple of things happening in 2020 that we have to keep a keen eye on. And I think the one thing that is different from 2016 to now is it kind of reminds me of the 2007 elections, in which we came out of 2 wars, an economy that was going through a hell of a lot, and a president who came out to inspire. I think this time we have to kind of inspire ourselves, because a lot of candidates, while many are talking about the issues that are important to us, none are talking about the kind of nuance I think people of color and communities of colors are looking for in terms of, like, when you talk about climate change, we're not talking about how it affects the parts of the Caribbean and how it's affecting the global atmosphere, not just the United States of America. When we talk about climate, we're also not talking about how it's affecting communities of colors, particularly where black women are having high infant mortality rates, right? So I think we have to get really nuanced and ask candidates to do more in terms of being more specific, as particularly as community of colors, about how it's going to affect our communities.
Yeah, I think you both are spot on. I mean, one of the things I've been saying for even well before the 2016 election is that we have to pay attention to the courts. And we're already beginning to see how the direction is going. Right now, it's kind of in a balance, so to speak. You know, the major decision maker behind major decisions now is Chief Justice John Roberts. But the question now is, with the unfortunate health scares that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is going through, and, you know, with President Trump, you know, he's been quiet about it, but, you know, been saying his attacks against Judge Sotomayor. You know, the worst case scenario this country could have is a 7-2 conservative majority. And I don't think our communities understand those heavy implications. So then the question will now become, how do we make that language understandable for them to understand? Because everybody is not paying attention to what's happening. Like, you know, we have the impeachment hearings going on, where, you know, debates are happening, but everybody's not paying attention. So how do we get this important message to our communities in plain English? What do you think are the strategies?
I think you have to frame the conversation, right? And what do you mean by frame the conversation? Frame the conversation means when people get mad at police officers for police brutality, I get mad at legislators for not passing legislation, right? Because they are enforcing laws that are in the books. Whether you agree or disagree with the laws, the reality is the lawmakers can change those laws. When you think about when you are faced with being arrested and now seeing the judge, it is a judge who makes a determination on whether or not you're free or not free. I think by framing, again, going really cutting the dice really small, people to see how the onion is layered, and showing how legislators are really important. And we saw that because in 2016, though we lost the United States presidency, New York State has enacted more progressive policies because we elected good legislators. And we also have a deep bench right now of people who are fair. I won't say progressive, I'll say they're fair. They're looking at the law for what it is. So I think we have to continue to create discourse and conversation around how do we get here and how do we get out of this rut.
Interesting.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Brian. It is about framing the conversation. And when you look at voter rolls and you look at the different polls that people take, what people respond to are things that affect them in their daily lives, right? It's not enough to just talk about climate change in the broad strokes and say that, you know, the waters are rising, but people don't see it every day. They don't recognize that it's happening and that it's going to happen in the future. But if you talk to someone about Medicare, right, or Medicaid, right, that's why you have so many senior voters, right? Because these things directly affect their lives, how their care is going to be handled, who's going to be doing it for them. So if you talk about issues that directly affect people, especially within the black communities where we're kind of, you know, demonized culturally, you have to talk about things that are going to affect their daily lives. So when we talk about policing, right, that's obviously something that always comes up, and about how we're going to rein in kind of police brutality and who's going to be answering when it comes time for things to come down. We also need to talk about how we're going to get the living wage up, right? So candidates who are talking directly to people about what a federal minimum wage should look like, those are the ones who are really a driving force right now, and they're getting a lot of support behind them. So as long as we can frame it to where people can understand it and how it affects them, that's the way that it's really going to be more impactful.
And interesting what Shadoe just said about the federal minimum wage. 10 years ago when Barack Obama was elected president, the federal minimum wage was $7.25. Today, Donald Trump was president. This is 10 years later. The cost of living has gone up in all states, not just New York State and New York City, and it's still $7.25. So that just says where we need to be focused in our conversations on, like, these details about how $7.25 affects somebody living in New York City whose studio costs $2,000.
I agree. I mean, you know, when you hear these real everyday issues that impact us, I find it quite startling when you hear elected officials say, you know, there's only but so much we can do. from what I've studied in political science, that the greatest resource in a governing country is the government. Like there's no resource to topple that, right? Because they have a limited amount of resources and everything. So why do you feel like these issues that impacts us, right? From housing to, food insecurity, food inequality, immigration, why do you think they intentionally constantly say to us, it has to take leaps and bounds versus just doing something progressive? Because one of the conversations that's been going on recently, I'm probably sure you heard, President Obama came out during his Obama Foundation Summit, and he kind of pretty much threw some jabs in saying that, being woke on social media is not action. But for the next generation, which is who's infused in technology, this is the way they express their voices. So I guess the question becomes, how do we get our elected officials to see the progressive agenda and that this way works?
So I agree with my old boss. So I worked with President Obama, so I'm gonna say that straight up that I agree with everything. And you run for president, everybody's like, I was Obama.
Right.
No, I did work for my Brothers Keepers Alliance, but I do agree with the president that being social media woke is not enough. And again, social media animates.
Yes.
But social media also does another thing. He spoke about this 8 years ago, and people kind of missed it in the conversation. Is that social media reinforces to the same groups that you speak to all the time the same things you believe. When you like someone's posts, the analytics actually keep showing you those posts over and over. So it's actually just reinforcing the same thing. It's not really speaking to groups and getting out of your comfort zone to have tougher conversations with folks. So I think one, we have to have tougher conversations. The second piece that we really have to do is look at how the power is not necessarily with the elected officials.
Yes.
Right? The power actually resides with the people. Why is that? People believe their civic duty is going to the polls and voting every 2 or 4 years when there's a special election. God forbid a special election. Oh my God, I got to vote 3 times. But the reality is the power actually lies in our ability to keep making this government more fair, more equitable, more just. Medicare for All was not a conversation a couple of years ago. People made that a conversation. This conversation about the boomers versus Generation X or millennials, remember, the boomers were once young people when they were boomers, right?
Yes.
So this whole conversation has always been young people and people who've been tired of oppressive systems fighting back against the system, but not just on social media. It's just going to animate. And again, I agree that social media has incredible value in terms of amplifying a message. We saw that with the Arab Spring and others, but the reality is it only captures what is actually happening. So if nothing's happened, we're just posting, nothing's going to be captured to be animated.
That makes sense. So then that leads to the next question now, right? Because I feel one of the things that this country is doing more and towards the progressive direction is electing more people who have a true progressive agenda that is really thinking about the entire well-being of the areas that they're serving. We're electing more younger people, but that's a slow progress. But the backlash that I've been hearing from students and people who are interested in running for office that are around our age is one of the big 3 things. 1, you lack experience. 2, you need to, be under someone to gain such experience. Or 3, you should have, the particular educational or organizational credentials. And one of the things I say in response to that is that if you could show me that in the U.S. Constitution, the New York State Constitution, or the New York City Charter, then I understand. But if that's not there, why do we believe we have to have these particular things in order to make it work? Because what we have seen in our communities, and just all across the country, elected officials that have said experience, but they do a horrible job. And I think our country is becoming more coherent to, not focusing more on experience, but giving someone an opportunity. But you still have people who are in, said establishment that feel that our way works. So how do you think we can get, encapsulate our communities to say that if you have the passion to lead and you really want to make a difference, encouraging them to do that without feeling like they're going to be, just looked over or ran over?
Yeah. I use the same refrain that I use with young people who come into our offices and are looking for opportunities and are looking for different jobs. And they're like, I don't have a resume, right? Or I don't know how to make one. And then you have to sit them down, you have to actually go through and ask them the different things that they do throughout their life, right? If it's not just a job, it can be volunteer opportunities, it can be taking care of siblings at their home. And you actually have to have them sit down and go through it and say, you actually do have a great wealth of experience, right? When people look at job postings, they read the entire description, they go, I don't know if I'm qualified. It says minimum minimum qualifications here, 3 to 5 years. It's BS, right?
Right.
Most of the time, it's just for an HR to kind of do a culling pre-hand before other people get involved, and it doesn't have to look at 100 different resumes. It just looks at 10. But if people were actually confident in themselves to say, I don't have this specific set of skills, but I have everything else, just go for it, right?
Yeah.
We saw the greatest example with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right?
Yes, Cortez.
But
That's why I just say AOC.
AOC, but she was the best example of going against an establishment candidate, right? Joel Crowley was set to be the second or third, or strongest politician within the Democratic caucus throughout the country.
Right.
And she toppled him, right? Because she had confidence within herself, and she knew that she could do a better job, especially at responding to and being the person for her community that was going to provide leadership. If we told our young people, and if we told people within our generation that they can do it, and we get other backers behind them, it doesn't have to be the same ones who are part of the establishment, right? They don't have to already be part of the Democratic Party. They can be from the working families. They can be from a third-party candidate. But as long as we tell them that they can do it and we give our backing behind them, I think it'll be a lot easier for people to throw away all of the things that you mentioned and say that I can do this.
The other thing that Shadoe, I think, is hitting on the head is this idea that we use in our office as well, this language of lived experience versus experience. What does lived experience mean, right? Lived experience is the idea that I've experienced something, I've learned from it, and I want to provide a resource to a community because of it. So when you talk about people who are homeless, not formerly homeless, homeless people cannot run for office because they don't have an address.
Right.
But that experience is so needed in the halls of City Hall and the state legislature when we're talking about a housing crisis and how people got somewhere. People who are former addicts or people who were users of drugs, they should be a part of that conversation. People who are domestic violence victims all should be a part of the conversation. What happens with our legislator, because of the experience factor that we self-impose on people, talking about the education, the school you went to, and the background, whether you be a lawyer or a finance person, is we have a DC and a state government that looks the same. People are lawyers, financiers, or former union workers, right? And how does that play into like who we are as real people, right? Most of the times it's not students, it's not people that look like us, or janitors. There are very few sanitation workers. I think Darlene Milley from was a former sanitation or MTA worker. But we really get those experiences of people who have a lived experience that connects with our own realities, and I think that's really, really important. The second piece is, I think the second piece is that people live in fear, right? So a lot of us, again, no one is telling you can't run. People have a choice not to vote for you. But the reality is many of us have to put aside our own fears and just say, you know what, I believe in myself, I believe in my community, I want to represent my community, and you run. I mean, when I ran for city council, I ran against a 14-year incumbent, which was like, people like, you're crazy, you're not gonna win the race. I came in second place, I didn't win the race, but I won the hearts and minds and the policy conversation of so many other people, and we expanded the conversation. And what we did was we didn't look at the triple prime voters or the double prime voters, we looked to expand the electorate by looking at people who wouldn't traditionally vote. So the guy on the corner that you never say good morning to, guess what, that might be your voter. Right? So we have to get past our fears and also just bring our lived experience into the things like AOC and so on. I was a bartender, and being a bartender, that's a unique skill, right? Being able to connect with people that are in different places. Some are depressed, some are happy, some are too drunk, and you shouldn't serve them anymore, right? Right. But the reality is just like how to connect and navigate those spaces and use that to your advantage. So
yeah, I agree. I mean, everyone has a unique story, right? You couldn't be where you are if you didn't have those events to make you where you are. That doesn't mean that it's a part of, you still succumb to those events, right? Because otherwise we wouldn't be where we are today, right? If we were stuck in our stories. So you mentioned something very important where, if we encourage our young adults and young people to run, because there's plenty of positions that you could start at the age of 16, but it's not being promoted or produced. And I've mentioned this many times where you have people who come in and they'll tell young people, young adults, go out there and do it. And then they say, all right, I'm gonna do it. Whoa, wait a minute. I didn't think you was going to take my words very, very seriously. Like,
but not against me.
Right, but not against me. And so the question that I have, I always try to say, I find it so interesting that, you encourage young people, young adults to go out there and be active in their community. However, when they do it to challenge you or set others that you may be in relation to, it becomes a problem. And I would think that if you feel you're doing such a great job, you would welcome a challenge. That's what I've learned in leadership, right? Because it keeps you on your toes. You're being challenged because there are people in the community that don't see what they feel should be done in the communities. And it gets very ugly. Like if you look over the research over the years of young adults who have stepped up to challenge incumbents and challenge the establishment, heinous, ads of their personal life. They just getting started. They're experiencing life just like all of us. I've seen one candidate, I think it was out in Connecticut. There was an ad talking about, oh, he was drinking back in the days. And it's just like, well, is that really a bad thing? Was he causing clear and present danger? Like, if you want to take it to the legal side. So I guess the question becomes, how do millennials, us as millennials, overcome those particular feats? Because unfortunately, it can get very ugly. You know that, I know that. It could get very ugly. But how do one overcome that fear and embrace their story and still be able to use that to connect to the community? Because I think that's very important.
I mean, I think the fear factor, again, as we mentioned earlier, is like just dismissing the spell of fear. If you look at any one of our closets, we're going to find something that someone didn't like. Particularly what we're noticing now with social media is that a lot of older elected officials who didn't post a picture themselves are now starting to find old pictures of them and faces that don't look like their color. Right? So I think that it's just one of those things that you have to kind of dismiss that fear factor of knowing that when you run for office that you're not perfect. You got to put it all out there. And I think by running, even if you're, I know Simple Leaf run every year, and I used to ask myself, why are they running every year? But they're running every year, not necessarily always to win. I think Simple actually do think they're going to win, and Simple don't. But they're actually forcing the conversations that would not be had unless they run. So I think it's really important for people to just put aside their fears, and even if it's a single issue, like Medicare for All has become a single issue for Bernie Sanders and for Elizabeth Warren, particularly this race and the rise in pay inequity. But I think if folks just put out that one single issue, whether it be improving transportation, creating safer bike lanes, environmental policies. I think Raphael Espinal, the councilman from Brooklyn, talked about nightlife laws. I think it's just important to just find something that you care deeply about and fixing the conversation around that and focusing in people in your community around that issue and how it affects their quality of life.
Of course. And so, go ahead.
And just to piggyback off of what Brian said, I think that in this day and age, being forthright and being honest about who you are and what you've done is incredible these days. I don't agree with anything that the Trump administration does, but one thing that he has shown is that he is a shrewd politician in the sense that when things come to conflict him, it isn't just about shooing it away, it isn't about covering it up and putting it under a rug. It's like, no, I did that, right? And that's something that his people respond to, right? They love the fact that he's a brash, egotistic, just kind of everything about his leadership style is encouraging to the people that are part of his base. And I think that within our communities, I'm not saying that everyone's background should necessarily be kind of exposed, but if it is, just be honest about it, right? Tell people what your experience was, why it happened, and just move forward with it. Because people will judge you on your character and what you say in front of them rather than what happens outside of that.
I think, one of the theme, if I can say one thing, if there's many words that I'm sure generations down the road, they're going to talk about us as millennials. Right now, we're in the spotlight in the global sphere, right? And one of the things I would say that describes us is authentic, right? I think we are unapologetic about what the things that we've done, what we've gone through, because it helped us to get to where we're going. And, when I teach, political science classes, students get rattled when I say, I think Donald Trump is an authentic leader. And they're like, wow, how? I'm like, but he's being himself. And, the polar opposite of how the country moved forward with President Obama, that portion of the country, or that half of the country that was waiting for their next big hero, emerged. Wiped out the entire establishment in terms of everybody counted him out.
He had a pretty loaded field when he ran for president himself.
And he overcame that by doing what he do best. And you don't have to agree with it, but if you look at it in the context of what leadership looks like, he kind of said that, and that's why he still has his 63 million plus voters strong or whatever. But now bringing it to the local level, right? Because while everything that's happening on a presidential level is very, very important, it's what's happening on our streets that is the most important. The greatest impact happens on the local level. And so where do you think, the daily issues that we face will touch and connect to the everyday common person, the person that's out there on the streets, the person that has seen or experienced gun violence or criminal activity or just food insecurities or housing issues, childcare issues? Like, how do we get the message of what's happening on that level and tying into the everyday life of the person who may not be paying attention to what's going on?
I mean, it's a fascinating question because I was recently in California a couple of weeks ago, and I was driving through Beverly Hills, where they would drive Crenshaw, Compton, they just going through all of California. And I asked myself the question, I said it to my wife and a friend of mine was in the car, and I said, I'm not sure how one person can be the president of all of this. right? Because when you look at like the experiences that happen in each community, they're very different. They're vastly different. When you're Rodeo Drive, it's bougie, right? When you're in Crenshaw, it's like, oh wow, okay, all right. Tuck my chain, like, Nipsey, I see you, right? No, but the reality is, I think that's why it's so important when you think about like the role of a city council or a state legislator, and because when you talk about the city council, we talk about that so broadly as well. Like New York City is a crazy place, and I say that because I was doing a research assignment last night, and I realized that in my city council race in New York City, I had more votes as a person than Pete Buttigieg got as a mayor in South Bend, Indiana. And I'm not dissing Pete. I'm just saying that the scale of communities are very different. And in New York City, you have an opportunity again to look at communities like Flatbush and East Flatbush, Dickens Park, and Proctor Lefferts Garden. And even in that context, all those neighborhoods are different. Their needs are different. And you have to lean in as a person. And it requires not just, like you said, their posts like district leaders and state legislators and community board leaders. There's so many different ways to get involved in a government context and actually make an impact that I think it's incumbent on us to figure out like what lane we want to play, what role do we want to play. For me, it's always been like, how do you pass legislation that enhance a city by changing communities and helping sustain communities? And I think people have to lean in on that and figure out like what is their neighborhood saying, and how do I use my resources, my tools, whether that be through a nonprofit vehicle or through a political vehicle, to advance those causes.
Yeah. What I think of is something that Brian mentioned earlier, and I was talking about the census, right? And this is something that happens only every 10 years, which is half of a generation, right? And so a lot of people don't understand the kind of importance and the role that it plays and the impact that it has for generations after it. In Brooklyn in particular, it was learned that it was one of the most undercounted districts as a county, right? Kings County was one of the most undercounted districts in the country. I think it was in the bottom 5.
But the 4th largest economy in the country.
Exactly.
In the country.
It's about like the 5th biggest city, right? If Brooklyn by itself outside of New York City,
its own city.
it could be its own city. It could be the 5th largest, I believe, like in the United States. And it was severely undercounted, in particular in communities where there are large masses of Black and brown people. That is abhorrent. That shouldn't happen. And that's where it begins, right? And talking just about how much representation you receive on the local level, on the national level, you know, your representatives. That's where it starts, with people literally being counted. And for people that were originally not considered in the Constitution, we were 3/5 of a person, we need to get every single person counted in our communities. And so we're part of this coalition that's in Brooklyn now, that's coming out of the Brooklyn Borough President's office. A lot of pastors are getting involved in actually making sure that communities know that this is important for them to get counted. So if someone has a neighbor who's a recluse, who is not civically engaged at all, we're saying, hey, you can be the person that just goes and say, hey, this is a simple form. It's not going to be used against you in any type of way. This information cannot be passed around to any other federal agencies, but it's important that you're accounted, right? Even if you don't believe in it, this is how we get more resources into our community. This is how we get more money for our hospitals. This is how we get more money for those lights that keep going out on our block. And again, when you frame the conversation into things that people see in their everyday lives, when they go to the deli grocery, when they go to the bodega, when they're walking down the street and there are shots being fired around their neighborhood, you have to talk about what resources and what's going to benefit them. And I think that the census is a really good and easy kind of leeway because it's literally people just filling out a questionnaire. We're also trying to get a lot more people hired by the Census Bureau. And they've been doing a lot of work, particularly throughout New York City. And New York City has done a great job in providing resources and funds to get more people hired, because we really do need a lot of community folks on the ground doing this. It will be a grassroots effort, but the type of ripples that will come from it will affect us all in many positive ways, and we have to be the ones on the ground really pushing it for each other.
And just doubling down on what Shadoe said, $790 million. $790 million is what's lost when we don't fill out the census. We've lost congressional seats because we haven't filled out the census data. And it's not just the people that like us who are talking. The baby that is actually born that's 1 week old, for 10 years, her school or his school will be under-resourced if they're not counted in the census. So all these things are interconnected, which is why you can't divorce the issues of the census. You can't divorce the issues of the Supreme Court. You can't divorce the issues of representation, as Shadoe mentioned, because in Brooklyn with 2.5 million people that we know of, right? 2.5 that we know of. We have only 16 council members, which sounds like a lot, but in the context of serving or representing 179,000 people, we probably need more representation. We lose that if we don't fill out this documentation.
I agree, and I think there is a strong push, especially because of how politics works in terms of unfortunately, gerrymandering is still in effect, but the House is still controlled by Democrats. So it's like if everything goes well in 2020, we can really change the next decade of what democracy looks like, and especially on all levels. And we're starting to see that emergence happen. So some of the work you all do in your community is really, targeting gun violence and police brutality, and really empowering young, Black and brown people to really be involved, but to also, do something positive. Politics don't necessarily hit them on that level because one, it's like there is no connection to it. So I remember an example. I spoke at Brooklyn College talking about the importance of why we must vote. And I realized that the messaging has to be different, right? We understand the importance that we must vote because there's so many people who fought, sacrificed, and died for it. But unfortunately, Generation Z does not have that unfortunate direct relationship to it because there is a different timeline. But we can cater to what they're experiencing, which is what you said. Every day there's an opportunity that they could unfortunately be targeted by police. Every day there's an opportunity they could experience racial cyberbullying, or that if they hop the MTA, they can be, charged or fined for something, ridiculous. So how do we get to those people on the streets that, need to understand the importance of what's happening? Because even in the street life, politics still affects what they do. I can recall I believe under Bloomberg's administration, where there was a moment, the signature thing in New York or in our communities was to hang on the corner. And remember there was a moment where it was like you could not hang on the corner because you would get arrested, and taking away that livelihood of what they're trying to do. So the question is, how do we get to those voices? How do we get to those?
I think the reality is, like, a lot of people have never interacted with politicians. They don't realize that politicians are people, right? Separate the titles for a second. There's the guy that goes in a sweatsuit, Nike sweatsuit at nighttime, and he gets home to the bodega and buys the milk. The guy that passes you in the morning, the woman who passes you in the morning. So I think it's one, connecting those dots, that they're people, that they live in these communities, or hopefully. And the other piece I think that's crucially important is to remind people that when we read history, the people that were the actors and protagonists in those stories didn't realize at the time they'd be part of the story. And I think right now we're at this weird moment where as millennials, if you look at all we've been through, we're the generation that survived 9/11. We were in high school when 9/11 happened. We're the generation that survived, you mentioned stop, question, and frisk. You didn't say it directly, I'm gonna say it. Stop, question, and frisk. So there are a lot of things that this generation has gone through. Record numbers of incarceration, over 2 million people incarcerated in this country, mostly Black and brown, right?
Survivors of the crack epidemic.
So like, we look at all these things, we are the protagonists in the stories, and the question is, what story are we going to tell our children and our children's children? The story of resistance and fighting back against these oppressive practices, or the stories of saying we curled up and waited for the next generation to come and solve it. So I think that's what we are, like, and that's why even the next generation, Gen Zs, the Gen Zs are even a little more like, a little more. They're like, what are you guys doing to the millennials, right? Like, it's just this competitive nature of like how to eradicate major structural systematic problems.
Do you think our current establishments are afraid of the inevitable change that's happening? Because you're hearing, there's been a lot of reports of boomers really just hammering down how they are displeased with the trajectory that we're going in our government, in our diversity, in our, positions in our respective legislatures. So how do we connect them to let them know that you're still benefiting from this progress? Because they feel very disconnected, because it's like, it's like it's like a spotlight on a stage. So it's like the spotlight's slowly beginning to fade away from the boomers, right? Because you barely hear from the silent generation. And so right now it's about Generation X and Millennials. So it's like, how do we make sure that they're still connected, that you're still a part of this?
Well, the truth is that boomers and anyone over the age of 50 are still the #1 voters in this country, right? They're the ones that people and politicians necessarily count on to actually get to the polls and make their voices heard. I do agree with you that there's a disconnect between the communities. I go to a lot of community board meetings, I go to a lot of community meetings by the NAACP, and when you go there, most of what you see are seniors or people over the age of 50. You don't see a lot of young voices, and you always hear the same refrain, where are the young people? Why are the young people not coming? What are we not doing enough of to make young people want to be around us or to work with us to enhance our communities? And that's a great question that they have that I don't think anyone still has the answers for, because like you said, these two seemingly are butting heads.
Right.
But there are tons of issues that are affecting all the communities at the same time. In Bed-Stuy and in Crown Heights where we work, gentrification is an issue that's affecting all generations, right? It's affecting the mom who's just looking to get her first apartment and just trying to stay there when she has 3 jobs. It's also affecting the homeowner who's been there for 40 years, whose taxes are being raised, and at the same time, they're trying to keep other black and brown people within their community, but they feel like they can't because the rent rolls are so high, right? Because they have so many maintenance fees nowadays, because they don't feel safe enough when they have another black or brown person within their home that they're starting to rent out to others who may not have been in the community for years. We need more dialogue, quite honestly, right? We need more people sitting down at round tables just like this, talking about similar issues that they do have and how we can both enhance our community but help each other out at the same time. I do think that there is a place where, as you mentioned before, millennials are taking leadership positions, but I do think that there also needs to be more laying of groundwork from the boomer generation, even from the Generation X generation, where people are talking about it's kind of their time and they feel like they've been skipped over a lot in these conversations. But if you bring the same issues, they'll find out that they have a lot more commonalities than they do things that are apart.
I think what Shadoe's referring to, and I totally agree, is this idea of common purpose and common cause and connecting the dots. I think part of it is also like connecting the stories, right? Again, a lot of us fail to study history, and by failing to study history, not only do we miss a large segment of how we got here, but we also miss a way to communicate and channel conversations back to a period in time where this happened. So when you think about the New Deal and FDR, how do you connect this economic moment in history to the new Green Deal, right? It's connecting those stories so that people don't feel like this is a whole new thing, but it's a continuation of a thing they started. People like to be a part of stories. So when you talk to someone, you say, how do you feel about so-and-so? People ask them how they feel about themselves or talk about themselves. People get perked up and excited. When you come and just tell somebody what you're gonna do, opposed to asking them, how do you think we get there? I think it changes. So it's always like, what do you think about gentrification? What do you think about this issue? Listen to them, well, here's what I think. And then sometimes you find the common webs that you can tie together. So I think it's just finding common sense of purpose and connecting those stories together.
And I think you said something very important, because voting, right? Like I said, I don't think we really grasp the understanding of how powerful our votes are. When I tell communities that major political positions are being decided by less than 10,000 votes in some areas to govern over 150,000 people in some areas, that should be raising a lot of questions, right? The city of New York, we know in the last mayoral election, right, less than 2 million people overall came out, right? The mayor won by less than 1 million votes. So it's like, and if you pay attention to the different positions, some are voting higher, like some controllers' votes results are much higher than others. So it's like, how do we grasp the concept to the people that are watching, the young people, the young adults, on why it's important to vote? I hear a lot of voter registration drives, which are absolutely important, but one cannot vote if they don't be reminded as to why it's important. And I don't know if we're really getting that message out there. So what do you think we can say to those who are watching in understanding why it's important to vote?
I think that one of the greatest things from the millennial generation in talking about social media is that they make things cool, right? When we talked about Diddy, it was back in like 2007, 2008, right before the Obama election, he did the whole rock the vote thing, right? That I think that was, or maybe that was 2006.
That was 2004.
Yeah, exactly,
right.
yeah. But they made it cool to like get people to vote, right? They actually had hip hop concerts that were going on when people were trying to get to those so they could say they were part of it. Having those little stickers is one of the greatest things as far as PR is concerned that New York City has ever done, because everyone gets that sticker and then they take their selfie. Then it's on Instagram. And even people who aren't typically voters end up doing that because they want to be a part of something. Just like Brian said, people want to be a part of a narrative. People want to be part of a movement. In 2008, people wanted to elect the first black man into the presidency. Everyone wanted to be a part of that movement. Everyone wanted to say when they're 50 and 60, hey, I voted for Obama. I was there that day. And I think that's one of the greatest things that we can continue to try to do, is to make these things seem cool, because they are cool, right? Being disenfranchised is not cool. And that's actually what's happening to the over 2 million people throughout the country, right? People need to be more aware that more of our people are being disenfranchised for whatever reason. We're almost going back to Jim Crow when it comes to like these poll taxes that are trying to keep people away from the voter rolls, and that's something that we all have to take on together. But I think the more that, like I said before, we can get people to understand how these things affect their daily lives and talk about the issues as it applies to them, the more we'll get them to understand and be students of history themselves when it comes time to vote.
I have nothing to add to that.
So then I will ask this question then. Why do you feel it's our communities, African American, Hispanic, Latino, Latina communities that are being targeted intentionally when it comes to voting, suppression?
Because we're not as low as, we're not a minority, as people often say. So I reject the language of the minority groups.
Yeah, I don't like using that terminology.
Because I can't believe that we're still just like 10 to 14% of the population at
Right.
this point. And if we were, why are you so afraid to let us vote?
Yeah, and that's the question. Like, why is it that, what is so threatening about our supposed 10%, but you can't win an election on the presidential level without us?
You want the real answer? You want the real answer?
That's what we're here for.
I mean, listen, we have a real conversation. Let's talk about
the real
it.
answer is economics.
Okay, so let's
You
hear
think
it.
about boomers and you think about millennials, there's a war that's going on between the two, okay boomer and okay millennial. It's about your policies might affect my nest egg and my retirement. When you think about why people who aren't people of color, people who are white and quote majority culture, by giving up something, they feel like they're going to lose something. So I think this all goes back to the idea of economics. Think about gentrification and what that implications are. People being added to a community does not mean that people have to be taken out of a community, right? The new coffee shop is something that I want to go to. I want the juice bar, I want the new gym, I want all those new things. I want the revels in my neighborhoods. I want the city bikes.
Right.
The reality is that all of a sudden they're showing up when you're disenfranchising folks. I think for me at least, I believe the real issue is economics and how do we get at the heart of economic inequality that has been a part of this country's history since the time that ships arrived here. How do we get free labor out of people? How do we, as Shadoe mentioned earlier, get 3/5 of a person? We do that through not counting them. We do that by not giving them representation, not giving them a voice, not giving them economics, not giving them power. And I think when you keep doing those things, you continue to perpetuate power and white supremacy. Yeah. I said it. Sorry.
No, this is why we're here. It's a real conversation. So now this leads to, I think you said something very, very important in terms of the social economic statuses of our communities, right? There's a place where we're living in a time now where rich and poor are so extremely polarized. The global media is highlighting the economic inequalities in an explicit manner, but yet nothing's really being done about it. There's so much data that economists are saying that necessarily shows that, the top-down effect does not work. We see what's happening in our city. Our New York City has become outrageously expensive. People are spending $2,900 for a refrigerator-sized room, and that's
we're in
deemed
my apartment
right.
now.
This is the apartment right here, and it's deemed affordable with a starting salary of $75,000. That's happening in our communities
every day,
right? I mean, there's all this new high-rise real estate, there's all these things, and it shows not just a generational divide, but an economic divide, and it gives us kind of false hope that how can we ever get to that next bracket, even as someone who has the different amounts of education. So I guess the question becomes, what do you think our legislatures should do, even though the answer may be simple, but for our audience who may not understand, like, what do you think our state legislatures, our city legislatures should do to really bring this, to make this, come to light in a way where everyone understands, where it's a human right and not a Democratic or Republican right, it's a human right.
I think the definition of what those rights exactly are is the conversation, right? Because nowadays we're having the conversation about progressive ideals, which include things like Medicare for all. It includes things about talking about a minimum wage, but really there are just a lot of different things that are talking about the failures of capitalism over time, right? And Bernie Sanders is being branded as this like major socialist, and there are some issues with people and that people have with talking about things as like a socialist policy, and it starts to scare people, especially when it comes to like boomers who fought against socialist regimes, right, when they were younger. But we need to talk about things and how we're sharing within this economy, because that's the only way that we can make America greater, actually, is by doing what it was built on, about people offering opportunity and access to folks who never had it before. And we're not doing that anymore. More and more doors are closing, right? Before it used to be you can get a college degree, get a great job, buy a house, get a car, have a great family, and you can be able to afford all of that. Now, a college degree is just another credential that kind of just, is something that's kind of passed over. It's just saying, well, now you need more, right? Now you need more experience. Now you need to be someone who's worked at a place for 30 plus years before I can say that you deserve a raise or you deserve to be in a leadership position within a company. And it's funny because the psychology shows that when it comes to privileges, people are more afraid of losing something than not getting something that they never had, right? So when we talk about power and oppression, it's because people at the top are afraid that they're going to lose whatever privileges or whatever economic access that they've had for any amount of time because they feel like they deserved it, because they feel like they've worked for it. And you can't tell them any differently on that. But if we talk about things that people have never had, it's a lot easier to have that conversation of saying, well, you never had, free healthcare before, right? Why don't we give it a try? Yes, it's going to be a little bit more money out of you versus in taxes, but at the end of the day, it's going to save, money across the board for everyone. And that's not a conversation that everyone is willing to have, again, because it's a me economy. Capitalism is built on individualism. We need to talk about the other end of it, where it could be a little bit of mix of capitalism and socialism, but where people really take the communal kind of ideas into the communities that they're in.
And the other piece, I think, particularly about housing in New York City specifically, because it's one of those things that if you don't have housing, you don't have anything really, almost, right? Particularly because of the weather we experience in New York. It's not like we live
extreme.
in a place that's like not going from really hot to really cold.
There's I like to say there's several temperatures. There's like, let's say right now it's 50 degrees. There's a New York City 50 degrees, and then there's the overall news weather 50 degrees. So it's very extreme, and I think that's something you raised that's very, very important.
Yeah, it's important. But and the other point that I was trying to make was just about like foreign investors and how much foreign interests are entangled in our housing. You have many apartment buildings that are up that have empty spaces that no one lives in. And the city has not imposed a vacancy tax on those apartments, or when you walk down busy business corridors, particularly in Black and brown communities, where landlords are sitting on property, and again, it's going to get me in trouble, sitting on property but not releasing to someone to take a chance on a business that may or may not fail, which they already signed a lease for, they didn't have to pay you for anyway. So I think this idea of like taking a chance and not creating these barriers, I think there's some barriers we're just creating, self-imposed, as Shadoe mentioned, to reduce the opportunity space for others. And again, I think that's something that we can really take a nosedive in the city and really enhance people's quality of life.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think there's an opportunity where we can really expose the real things that are happening in our politics, because it impacts us every day. And one of the things I like to say is that politics affects everything that we do, in some way, shape, or form, and whether you realize it or not. I say in relationships, you got to negotiate, you got to compromise, right? I'm sure first and foremost, right?
Out of my head like this,
right? In businesses, you work out deals and things like that. And I guess in this society, there is an awakening that's happening. I think 2016 was the moment where everybody really paid attention.
Did they though? And I asked that question, did they? Because after 2007, after 2 wars and the worst economic downpour in our country, we elected Barack Obama, and then we said, we did our job. Have fun.
That's true.
Like, I'm wondering, is this the moment where, playing devil's advocate, is it beneficial to keep Trump in office another 4 years just so we can stay on our toes? Like, and that's a real question, because I'm afraid of us going back to this place where we just go, and again, Trump is not the problem. Trump's policies are. I'm not attacking a person, I'm attacking policies that are affecting people. I'm also attacking ideologies of capitalism that are crushing our middle class and people who are working class. So the question is something we want to do? We want to go back to that time where we go, all right, we elected a Democrat, go do what you got to do, I voted, my civic duties is done here, but not challenge us to do more than tweet, as President Obama mentioned, more than just talk about these social issues, but actually be the driving force. And the day after Election Day, are we committed after November 6th of 2020 to keep the fight going and making sure that these things actually get actualized?
I think that's a very good question. many critics say about our generation. We know how to talk, we tweet, we will go out there, do videos and all that, but when it comes to where it matters the most, which is getting behind that polling booth, we're not showing up. The data, you see the data showing that. And I think that, you know, we do have to be much more consistent, right, than we ever been before. One of the things that I tell, you know, people in our community from a generational standpoint, what made our parents and our grandparents so powerful and effective, that they were consistent. When they said they boycott, they meant it. You know, it wasn't a 90, you know, day hot trending hashtag and then it disappeared. You know, they were consistent and vigilant, even when media and radios were not covering it. The real grit of movements happening. And I think to answer that question, we're not consistent.
And I don't want to over-romanticize our parents' generation either, because part of what we learned about the boycott that took place in Birmingham, Alabama, is that had they used the money they'd not spent, they could have bought a bus line. And we wouldn't be having this conversation about MTA swipes right now. Right, so it's so funny how, like, you know, again, we can romanticize and juxtapose generations, but the goal is, I think, to learn from each generation, build on it, and then try to figure out how do we do it better. So knowing that, how do we now do this better in terms of these MTA swipes? Should we be doing a bus boycott? Should we be using those 275 swipes we're going to spend anyway, putting that in a bank and creating our own MTA system, our own transit system, or buying it? I don't know. I don't know the answer to the question. I'm just saying that I think that it's something that's worth the thought-provoking piece of, like, how do we do more than the previous generation?
And we talked easily about, you know, language and about messaging that's coming out. And one of the things about our generation is that we're living in a dream deferred, right? We're going to be the first generation that's not doing better than the generation prior to it, or our parents' generation, or our grandparents' generation. And that's tough. That's a tough pill for us to swallow, to think of ourselves as, like, you know, incredibly entrepreneurial, to think about ourselves as enterprising, but for whatever reason, we're not going to make it as good economically as previous generations. And that's a really tough pill to swallow. I think when we talk about the work that we're doing and changing norms, right, and thinking about trauma and how that's affected people, we're going through trauma right now. We're saying that we've worked incredibly hard and that we deserve a specific type of privilege before, you know, or economic kind of opportunity, and we're not getting it. So if we talk about what the new American dream really is and talk about what it really means, I think we can start to, you know, kind of shift people into a way where they're not dealing with fatigue when it comes to elections, right? They're not just saying, oh, my vote doesn't count, and even if it does, it's not really going to do anything. We need to change the language about what it means to actually be civically engaged. That it's not only about elections, right? It is about going to those community board meetings. It is about showing up at your precinct when something's going wrong, not just when a crime is committed, but also just, you know, talking about your concerns with what police are doing well, but also what they're doing bad. And so the more we can have people think about these things and think that it's not just important just to get up and go to your job and pay your bills, right? All good things, and everyone should do that. Pay your taxes, right? Take care of your family, but also think about the places that you live. What's going on your block? What's going on in your building? If we can get people to rethink about community, right, as a set of norms and set of beings, we can think about how we can start progressing and moving the needle of change.
And I think what you're also hitting on, and tell me if I'm wrong, is this idea of redefining success.
Yep, absolutely.
Right, because part of our parents' generation of success, and we know it's really important to own a home, but that is like a critical piece of, like, the boomer versus millennial discourse, is that in order to purchase a home in New York City, they start at $1.1 million. The down payment on that is what, 10, 20%. I don't know if I can do it. I don't know.
I'm not there yet. I'm definitely not
let me know where you work out there. No, but I think that's part of it, like redefining community, redefining success, and also redefining what it means to be integrated, because we went from separation, from segregation to integration, and now we'll call it gentrification, which is some form of integration with displacement. How do we redefine what community looks like and what the norms are? Because a lot of the conversations we're having, particularly in, like, gentrifying neighborhoods, is you're right, I'm wrong. Don't stand in the corner. Stop walking your dog. I don't want your coffee shop. I want a bodega, right? But how do we have a conversation about those things and imagine what does norms look like for us, and not based on both the past, but just based on the here and now?
Yeah, I think those are things that are connected to the everyday local lifestyle of what we're trying to do. You know, I tell you an interesting story. I remember I was with my friends, my high school friends, over the summer. We graduated from South Shore High School, class of 2003. And we were just looking back and we're just reflecting over life. And behind the backyard in York District in East Flatbush area, there's a new, like, high-rise, quasi-high-rise apartment building, right? With a balcony in the back. And I was just sitting back there in the backyard and playing festive music, and I was talking to my friend's mom, and I remember telling her, you know, it's so sad that come next year, what we normally do may have to be silenced because unfortunately they're going to come in and not try to connect. That's one perfect example. Another example, I went to a block party in Bed-Stuy, and you can tell the significance of those who really are about the community and those who come in and they chose to be isolated instead of welcoming themselves to the community, right? And you know, we laugh at it because it's like, well, we don't bite. You know, we here to have fun. We'll give you a burger, beer, whatever it is you want. Like this is, you're in our neighborhood, we show love, but how do we bring, like you said, build that bridge where it doesn't have to be a necessary ethnic cleansing, right? In identifying these historical contexts, because we see it happen all the time between Harlem, Flatbush, East Flatbush, Crown Heights, you know, Bedford-Stuyvesant, that have rich culture, Bushwick and East Harlem, and they're now slowly becoming transformed without the recognition, the respect. So is there a way that, you know, through possible policies or just encouraging our communities to be civically engaged to kind of begin to have that conversation where we can build a bridge instead of keeping a wall up?
It's funny you say that. I mean, when you think about the work we do, as Shadoe mentioned earlier, it's around norm changes and Neighbors in Action. And we're Neighbors in Action because what we try to do is we try to bring people together to solve disputes outside of traditional systems. And I think it can be done. I think about an example of in my own neighborhood of Flatbush. There's a group of young guys, I won't say the block name to expose folks.
No problem, no worries.
There's a group of young guys who hang on the corner. They've been doing this when they were very, very young, generationally. Guys old as 40 out there with them. And they're a group of residents who just came on the block a couple of years ago, who just like, the loud music offends us, the smoking offends us, the carbs in your car offends us, and the garbage affects us. So we were able to get the young people. I had a conversation with the homeowners, then I spoke to the young people, then I brought them together, and they had a conversation, a meaningful dialogue about why these things affect them and the things that could work. And I think outside of politics, right? Because politics is also community. Like the people, again, when I said politicians are people, they live in communities. The voters live in communities. So this all interconnects to people in communities. Is how do we get communities to begin to talk again about the things that affect us and the way that we want to see our community governed. And that may look different from block to block. Some block may say after 9 o'clock the music is off. Some may say go to 11 o'clock. But how do we foster conversation and dialogue where we're not calling 311, we're not calling 911. We're able to say, hey, Shadoe, I think X, Y, and Z. Can I give you a call when it gets too loud because I got to put my kid to sleep or I got to go to work the next day. I'm on a remote call because I'm doing business on the other side of the country. So I think it's just like creating this spirit and this redefining of what community really means and how do we do that thoughtfully and intentionally.
Yeah, I agree. I'm a huge proponent for local control. And when I talk about local control, I do mean at the community level. When we talk about New York City, we talk about this vast city that's 5 boroughs, that's over 8 million people, and there's so many different disparate issues and so many disparate things that people have that goes on in their daily lives. We don't think enough about our neighborhoods, right? And which really are the focus and really are the hearts and the blood flow of what happens within New York City. I hear a lot of people talk different ways about how they feel about community boards, but for some people, it's the only way that they can feel that their issues are being heard at any big level, right? There's not enough town halls throughout the city. There's not enough council meetings that people can make, so they feel like they have to go to their local, community board, or they go to their local council member when they're available, and they say, this is when my issues are heard. We need for people to have more say in what happens to them locally. It's funny because whenever I've been to these community board meetings, one of the biggest things that always comes up is liquor licenses, right?
Oh yes.
So whenever the
I
new
used
bar,
to be on a community board, so I know.
whenever the new restaurant comes in or the new bar comes in, it only takes 6 months before they say, okay, in order for me to make more money, I need to have a liquor license, right? They go to the community boards and they ask for a recommendation. The recommendation is not binding. No matter what happens, the state liquor authority is going to have the final say, and they're not going to say no to any new fees. So at the end of the day, you have people clamoring saying, I don't need another or third or fourth or fifth bar on my block that's going to play music until 3 a.m. But at the end of the day, that wish is not being heard, and that wish is not being what the desired effect is. And so if we can get a way where we have more local control, where we actually devolve the power from the city council, from the mayor, on very specific issues, right? I'm not saying it needs to happen in the level of education. It doesn't need to happen on the level of like transportation. I don't need for people to start painting yellow on their sidewalk to say don't park in front of my spot. But we do need to have a kind of set of codified ethics that happen on the local level, that people need to feel that their voice really is being heard and the things that they're saying is just going up to the top.
Awesome, awesome. All right, so I guess as we prepare to wrap, this wonderful conversation, I could keep going for hours because I love doing this. I guess what are some of the things that you would want to tell the people in terms of going forward, getting involved politically, socially, and you can even do a little splur about your wonderful organization, because I think what you guys are doing is absolutely spectacular. So
I'll make it very simple. Vote, right? Get out there, register, get counted for the census in 2020. 2021 in New York City is going to be a huge time, right? We have all of the high-powered different seats that are going up: mayoral, comptroller, public advocate. Over 3/4 of the city council seats are up for grabs. Brian. So go out there, read up on the candidates, really find out who's going to be representing you in your district. Everything is online nowadays. It is so easy just to do a couple of clicks. But even if you can't find that information, talk to someone who does know, right? Talk to someone who within your community is very civically engaged. And then go out there, right? Just go and vote, no matter what you think, vote.
I mean, everything Shadoe said, but I think one thing I would add is just get to know your neighbors. One, it's so easy to live in a big city. When you leave your house, have your headphones in, come back and take the headphones out, and never communicate or look anyone in the eye. So I think that's one piece. Get to know the local business owners in your neighborhood as well. Support those local businesses. Not saying I use Amazon. I do. I'm a Prime member just like everyone else. I enjoy Prime Video, but I do think it's also powerful to get local business involved, because they're more likely to hire our kids for their first jobs and first opportunities. And the other piece is really staying engaged beyond just election day. I can't say that enough. People vote. And voting is so important, particularly because, like you said, you can win an election with a couple hundred votes, literally. Like for any seat in the city of New York, besides the mayor, they get up to a couple million, but it's still not the 8.5 million people we have. But the reality is we need people to stay involved in the process, to hold legislators accountable. You don't have to be a legislator to actually write legislation and get it passed. If something is affecting you and your lifestyle and your family and your community, and you feel like this is a continuous problem, you can draft the bill and send it to your council member, to your state legislator, to your members of Congress, and really push that up the chain. And more importantly, use our social media as a tool to amplify, not just to isolatedly talk in a vacuum.
Awesome. And so how should anyone get in contact with you if they want to get involved with your organization?
Yeah, so our website is neighborsinaction.org. All of our information about the great things that we do is there. We have social media. We also house SOS Brooklyn, so that's Save Our Streets Brooklyn, also has social media handles. Anyone can call us. We have 2 offices, one at 423 Gates and Bed-Stuy, and the other one's at 256 Kingston. So we're always open. We always have our doors open throughout the week. Anybody can come by anytime.
And the other thing I'll add, because as a director, you got to add that part, is if people want to fund an organization, to go to the website and to click donate, really,
That's
because if grantees and city agencies constantly fund us, they own you, opposed to when people actually not only put their hands to the dirt and toy the soil, but also give their resources, whether it be $1 or whatever the case, to help power that organization. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. I mean, this was an amazing panel, and I think our audience heard and will be reflecting on a lot of what we discussed. I definitely want to thank Shadoe Tarver and Mr. Brian Cunningham for coming out today, and I want to thank the entire Young Boss Media TV team for this amazing opportunity. Please be sure to follow us on our social media platforms. As we prepare for 2020, stay tuned for new upcoming episodes. But as we close, live in your purpose, live in your power, live in your freedom. That's how you begin to change the world. And it starts with you. Thank you all. We'll see you next time on The Vanguard.
And I was to smile at each other and
Act like we're talking.
like we're talking. The B-roll.
This is so funny to be
It's like just smile and nod.
Like this when the music begins.
Yeah, this is when the music. What am I talking about?